As a professor, I developed a terrible habit, and that was to do PowerPoint. I apologize. I also have to admit I'm a little sleep deprived, and so I noticed last night as I got my new computer out, which I was really happy about, and started doing my PowerPoint presentation. There's all sorts of neat new tools on PowerPoint, and I had the really bad idea to use some of those tools, which usually is just black and white. So I apologize. I think that some of these slides are going to be an eye exam for a lot of you. So we'll test that later on. So let's talk about where things stand. Listen, if you've been reading any stories in the press about this summit, you should know that we face real challenges on the PR side. Our efforts, regardless of how well-intentioned, regardless of how well or how benign, are going to be painted as something nefarious, something bad, something scheming and evil. And I want to point out that the public at large really likes horses. And generally, and I'm going to say this broadly, doesn't like the idea of killing horses. And I had the AP on here because I was excited yesterday when the AP picked this up. And the headline, did anyone read it yesterday? Critics, Secret Slaughter Summit, which I didn't know I was participating in. But I bet you guys didn't know that you were participating in that either. But now I feel, pretty bad, actually. I don't know. So I start out with that because you got to understand the problem. The majority of Americans think wild horses are this. Can anyone identify where that group of horses is from? You got no idea, right? I can tell you there's cowboys behind it. They're rounding them up through lush grass. That turns out to be Assateague Island. This is a photo from the National Park Service. And the wild horses that most eastern seaboard people will interact with look just like these little guys. And I say little guys because they're not even really technically wild horses. They call them ponies. And they're not protected under the Act, so it's a little different. They're rounded up each year. These cowboys right here are going to round up these horses. They're going to swim them across the bay. They're going to cull the foals out. They're going to sell them. There's going to be children's books written about this, about how awesome this process is. And that's what people perceive when we talk about wild horses that you're dealing with. Or they might think this. Can anyone identify that fine animal? That is Cloud from the PBS documentary of the same name. And it deals with a band of horses in Montana, I think. Is that right? Montana? It's been a while since I've seen it. It's Montana. And pretty majestic looking animal, right? Follows the livelihood of said animal, follows the pros and cons of how people treat these animals, mostly the cons of how people treat these animals, because the majestic animals deserve to run, right? Or, if you're the age of my children, wild horses are this. Does anyone understand who this is? This is Spirit, the stallion of the Cimarron. Or, in its most modern incantation, on Netflix series now that you can download today if you have the ability, a new children's series describing the importance of horses and wild horses. Okay? And the reason I point that out is because, to complicate matters, this is what the nation looks like. The one that it's only black and red, or white and red, does anyone identify what that is? That is the ownership of federal land, federal public land, and some subsurface as well, but by and large, you get the picture. The one on the other side that has more colors, do you guys know what that is? That is the population per square mile. And what you'll notice is, while they're not the same color scheme, and I apologize for that, you'll notice that the whitest colors also correspond with the reddest colors on the other map. And so what that all means is this. Congress's view, and we had Rob Bishop here yesterday, and I don't want to quibble with the chairman. Congress's view on wild horses is informed not only because they're idiots, but it's informed by a population that in many ways has had absolutely no dealings with wild horses at all. They know about what they've seen on TV, or they know what they've seen in their world, which is the ponies on the eastern seaboard. which there is no management problem there. In fact, we have dozens of studies to show that it's working out well. And so you got to understand that we start here with an information deficit. And I only point that out because we got some work to do. Okay, so I'm not going to cover this in detail. I'm afraid that you guys have heard it ad nauseum, and I apologize for that. But, you know, we have the Wild Horse and Free Roaming Burros Act, and not to delve into the details here, but we know that there were some robust tools allowed in the act itself to allow for management of wild horses. The act itself allowed to destroy old, sick, or lame animals by the most humane means possible, to remove healthy animals for private adoption, and to humanely destroy unadopted animals. Had all that, okay? So, what's happened in the time since? And Karen covered most of this, so I won't deal with it. In 1976, so the act is passed in 71, signed by Richard Nixon, who is the most environmental of all presidents, oddly. And you have now, in 76, people looking at it and saying, well, gosh, there's got to be some better ways to gather. And so in FLIPMA, in 76, they say we can gather through mechanized means, and specifically helicopters. In 78, they passed the Public Rangelands Improvement Act, which did a variety of things, established HMAs as well as AMLs, and allowed for the government to transfer full title of the horses to willing adoptive owners. And the act remains intact and swimming until 2004, where the Burns Amendment comes to be, where we say, listen, there may be some more tools that we need to put in play here, and so we changed the act in 2004 to allow the sale without limitation for animals that are at least 10 years old and have been up for adoption at least 3 times, and also allowed for wild horses to be used for commercial products. So, that sounds great, right? We've been very, very responsive. The reality is, however, that and this is the one where I'm testing your eyesight. You got it? And I did this maybe intentionally small because people are putting up their cell phones to take pictures. Makes me very nervous. I'm teasing. So you're going to have to really scroll in and expand on your pictures. The act's been modified in other meaningful ways. Congress, looking at the variety of ways the BLM was acting, has decided, and mostly through the appropriations process, something that my boss sits on currently, said, you know what? We're going to dictate how BLM spends money in doing this. They're going to create what they call appropriations riders, and they're going to say, money shall not be spent on some things, right? So language was added to the bill, or on the bill, on an appropriation riders from 1988 to 2004, prohibiting Department of Interior to spend any money to destroy healthy wild horses. That language was briefly removed after the Burns Amendment, and then was reinstated in subsequent years, as Karen talked about, and has been essentially in place since 1997 in some form or fashion, better for worse. What that all means is we got a problem, because right now the tools that were set out in the Act are not necessarily available under the Act because Congress has dictated that they shall not be. And so that leaves us with a variety of options of what we could do, and I'm going to go through some of the things that we all discussed. I'm going to do this real briefly because the balance of this afternoon could be spent on this, and I would love to get to more definitive conversation this afternoon. But we've got these options. We can change the Act, potentially. We can remove congressional restrictions, i.e. riders. We can increase transfer through sale or adoption. We can do fertility control. We can work on public-private partnerships. And I'm sure there's other tools. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I'm telling you those are the tools that people have identified as the most common things we could do. So let's go through this. Let's talk about changing the Act. That, partially fuzzy picture, that's my boss, Chris Stewart. He was here yesterday. Chris came to Congress in 2013. He represents the area where you are right now. He also represents almost all of the western part of the state with the exception of Box Elder County. That's also where we have the majority of wild horse problems in the area, and we've had a horse population issue for the duration of the time he's been in. So we started receiving calls from concerned people. And I'm not just talking ranchers, although there were a lot of ranchers who were concerned. We got calls from county commissioners. We got calls from a variety of other people, and Chris said, hey, we got to look at this. And I got to be honest with you, People like horses. Congress, while stupid, is also self-interested. And so Congress, you got to understand that most Congress people are not going to take up this issue. And they're not going to take up this issue because you get protested, you get nasty grams in the mail, you get terrible stories written about you. And Congress doesn't like that, I got to be honest. People don't like that in Congress because they have to face the electorate, and that goes down in the category of bad press. And so people are worried. My boss, notwithstanding that, said, hey, listen, I grew up farming and ranching. I think we got a problem. We got a problem because we have a horse population issue that's going to do two things. One, this is going to consume all of the budget of the BLM if we're on that trajectory. And in a district that's probably 70% BLM land, and that's not an exaggeration, it's mostly BLM land, that's scary because we rely on the BLM for a variety of things to make multiple use work. And those communities that are in that area, that 70% of the land, are very concerned that if the BLM is doing only wild horse holding, carrying, and feeding, the reality is we're going to have a problem on the range. We're going to have a problem because you're going to have ecosystem collapse, you're going to have all sorts of other problems, and you're going to have transfer from multiple use to single use, where everything that we used to do on public lands is now forbidden because now we have a single use, and that is managing wild horses. That's concerning. Second thing he's really worried about is this, and I'm not going to speak all green here, but this is not just about farming and ranching. This is about dramatic changes at the or the ecosystem level. And if you're talking about that, we have fragile ecosystems in the West. We may be looking at a very serious generational change in what that land can be used for, and my boss is pretty concerned about that. So he started looking at options, started to talk with the players, went to his colleagues in Congress and said, what can we do? We had meeting after meeting with other federal agencies. We even met with Fish and Wildlife and said, hey, we'd love to transfer these to you guys. And Fish and Wildlife, surprisingly, shockingly really, said no. And so after all this, we said, well, who was possibly capable of managing horses down to AML? And that's all we were looking for, is to manage it down to AML, because my boss loves horses. He does love horses. He's not just blowing smoke. He loves horses. And so how do you manage it down to AML? And the solution was, well, maybe because the state does other wildlife, maybe the states can take it. Now, we had a conversation this morning. Totally agree. This is a big liability for a state. I understand that. The question is, who else can do it at this point? So he introduced the Wild Horse Oversight Act. I have to claim credit for the acronym because we had an internal office poll, and it's the only thing I'm really proud of in Congress. To come up with WHOA, which is, if you Google it, it's a command to make a horse stop or slow down, which, that's great, right? That's all what we're trying to do here. Listen, I think the states are capable and competent to do it. They could do it. The question is, are we able to get this through Congress? And I have to tell you honestly, this hasn't it's a decent idea. Politically, it's been a non-starter. Okay, it's not moving its way through Congress. It's still waiting for hearings. It's waiting to make its way through the standard process. So my boss got frustrated. So what else can we do? So that's when we started. Well, before we get that, on changing the act, let me be very clear about this. There's a danger in changing the act, and I just want to be clear about this. The most recent attempts to change the act, not talking about my boss's efforts, were done in 2009 through the Restore Our Mustangs Act, sponsored by Representatives Rahal and Grijalva. Passed the House in 2009, not even close. It was 239 to 185, which would have increased the amount of federal acreage for horses, prohibited killing of healthy horses, created federal horse sanctuaries, and limited discretion of the BLM in herd management decisions. Passed the House, and not even close. So, fortunately, people in the Senate stopped it, but I'm just telling you, there's two sides to the story, and just be aware, okay? So, other options we had. So my boss said, well, let's look at other things that we could do, and we went straight to changing those riders. And this is something we've been working on. Cam Madsen is here in the front row. Cam, raise your hand. It's that shiny bald head. He shaved it just for you. We've been working on this. We've worked with colleagues. We've worked with Democratic colleagues. We've worked with a bunch of people trying to say, well, what can we do? Listen, I'm not going to tell you that this is the panacea. I'm not going to tell you this is the grand solution. But I'm going to tell you it's the best we could do to make meaningful progress on a problem that's going to overcome the BLM. And so this is what we fought for. We've been fighting for variations of this change for a number of years. This is what passed through committee and now is in the base bill that'll come before the House this September for the Interior Appropriations Bill. And we took out appropriations here and shall not be made available. We took out the language for the destruction of healthy unadopted wild horses and burros in the care of the Bureau or its contractors for the sale of wild horse and burros that results in destruction and processing for commercial products, including human consumption. I know the people in this room are not going to agree with all of that. Please understand, and I mean this sincerely, this is the very best that we could do to get it passed through the committee that we're in. And I'm not saying that to be a Debbie Downer. I'm saying that to say that we have a challenge in front of us, and that's why I'm asking for your help. Now, other things that we could do, and I'm just going to fly through these to get to the other presentations. Listen, we could increase transfer through sale or adoption. There's a variety of proposals out there, one of which is just to pay people to adopt the horses. Mathematically, you could pay up to $1,000 per horse for people to adopt them, the horses that are in current holding, and you could actually be ahead of what it costs to care and feed those horses per year, right? It's interesting. I'm not sure that would be enough. I'm not sure that would be enough for people to take them, but nonetheless, you could do that. I know that people push for the restore full ability to sell without limitation on adopted horses. Love the idea. The question is, can we get it done? And I'm doubtful right now. I'm not to say I'm doubtful that forever that's the case. I just don't see it right now. So we could do fertility control. We talked about that yesterday. We'll talk about it more this afternoon. There are pros and cons to this. It is perceived to be the panacea by horse advocacy groups as the solution, darting, and we can go out and have people track animals forever. I think it works in places like Assateague Island. In fact, we have studies to prove it. It is harder in places like Beaver County, Utah, where we have horses that occupy large bases on the range. And you guys saw on your tour on Tuesday, that's a lot of land, right? And you guys went over a lot of dusty roads. I hear it was pretty dusty. And found a singular horse, right? Now imagine if your first interaction with that horse was to dart it. How's that horse going to feel about your next arrival? And horses are not stupid. They're going to figure out that hurts, that's not fun, and they're going to make it more difficult for you to catch them next time. So it's going to be a costly thing. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying you got to understand there's costs involved. We could have public-private partnerships. I know Drew's here. Where are you, Drew? Drew Lasovsky? Drew? He said he'd be here. He lied to me. He's representing the American Mustang Foundation. Essentially what they're trying to do is be a private brokerage and place animals at a lower cost. So animals that are in holding, take them out of BLM holding facilities, place them on private lands at lower cost to the government, and then save us all a buck or two in care and management. And it's not a terrible idea. It's got support of people like the Humane Society and others. ASPCA has been pushing it as well to say, hey, rather than euthanize horses, this is what we should do. So here's the reality, though. We're left with hard choices. I'm telling you straight up, there's no political panacea for our current problem. It's going to be a fight to get common sense reforms, and those who want to manage wild horses differently from those in this room, I'm telling you, are far behind, are far ahead of us in tactics and emotion. They are. And so we just got to be aware of that. We've got to be aware that's the case. So moving right along, the only solution I see is effective advocacy, and I'm going to tell you one last thing, and then I'll be done, and that's the parable of the Assateague Island horses. This happened to me personally, and I was going to have a picture of my daughter, Emily, who's the cutest person. My son, my oldest son, is diabetic. And that means because he's diabetic, we don't have a lot of snacks around the house. And we heard from friends that you got to go to Assateague Island. You got to see it. You're going to go to the beach. You got to go. And so we're going to the beach, and we decide, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take Fritos because it's a special treat. Sure, diabetes be damned. We're going for it, right? And so there we go. We pick up our chili cheese Fritos for those who have played at home. Delicious, right? Actually, I've never had them, and I'll tell you why I've never had them. So at Astik Island, we were pulling onto the island, and there are the ponies in all their glory, and we thought, this is the greatest thing ever. My kids were enamored by the ponies, thinking this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. And there's the Fritos. Okay, sorry, wait a second. There's the ponies. There's the Fritos. The kids are super happy about the Fritos. We're excited about this. And here's the thing. Those horses came down the beach, and we realized that they weren't cute little ponies. They were marauding bandits. And not small animals. Yeah, they're small horses, but a horse is a fairly large animal. And it turns out that they can do a fair amount of damage coming down the beach as they go through people's beach sites. And they were plowing people over and ended up with my poor wife, who was defending the Fritos. And I understand that horses, I didn't know this, but I understand that horses love Fritos, and they've become accustomed in Astik. And those horses went right through our bags, okay? Grabbed the Fritos, threw them over their heads, and the ringleader, I'll call him, and he stomped on the Frito bag, and just orange haze of Frito goodness all over the beach. And those horses chowed down and then proceeded just in drooling Frito horse mess all over the rest of our stuff to destroy our beach site. Now, what happened was my kids, who thought these horses were the best thing ever, turns out they started hating the horses. In fact, I can tell you straight up, we've got one of these digital frames to where we have these revolving pictures, and I've got a picture of the ponies there. And to this day, when the picture of the ponies come up, my kids scream, "Ah!" It's the ponies. Now, what's the moral of the story? You may have a different opinion of these animals the more directly they impact your life. And I'm telling you this, we have to do a better job, I think, as a nation to discuss the actual trade-offs of our status quo. If we continue on the status quo, we have less money for other more important environmental programs or any other government programs that matter. People care about that. We will have a less healthy environment. People care about that. We have cost to other potentially imperiled wildlife. Sage-grouse is just a for instance. People care about that. We will have fewer hunting opportunities. People care about that. We have a failure of multiple use mandate. People care about that. And maybe most importantly of all, we will have a less healthy wild horse population. People care about that. That's the message I think we need to communicate. And I think if there's a call to action from my presentation, it's that we need to start pointing out those real trade-offs that we face. And with that, I really appreciate the time you've given. And I'm going to turn it over to talk more things, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thanks.